A Thing in the Woods. Chapter 8. The day that I found the body was the last time I ever went to the woods. All of those fond childhood memories, so pure and innocent, ended in one ugly and bitter moment. As I walked away from my old house, down the road that I had run down, skated down, rode my bike down so many times, I kept thinking about the path to the woods. With one left turn, I could be on my way. I don't know what I would expect to find there. Certainly there wouldn't be more bodies popping up all over the place. My old friends were long gone. I wasn't going to run through the grass or throw myself down any hills. The place that I wanted to go back to now existed only in my memory. Yet there was a part of me who wanted to go there anyway. I could still sit on the rocks beside the water. I could still lose myself in nature. I didn't make that left turn. I could hear children laughing and playing in the distance as I stood on the road, looking toward the field, with its tall grass swaying in the breeze. The place belonged to those kids now. What I'd found there was probably an old legend by this point, passed down to them in hushed voices at the back of a school bus. I didn't want to burst the bubble of their world by showing up in person. At least, that's what I told myself. I don't know. Maybe I didn't go to the woods because they scare me. Either way, I started to walk down the road again, remembering conversations that I'd had with my friends along that path. So many of them flooded back to me as I walked. I could almost hear the voices of my childhood buddies. A debate about superheroes, a dare to race down to the end of the street. I had a strange craving for one of those pre-packaged brownies that my mother used to pack in my lunch bag, the kind with the frosting on top, and when you squeezed it in your hand, it looked like dog poop. I haven't had one of those things in years. These days, I'd probably make my own brownies with a blend of different chocolates topped with ganache and chopped walnuts. The road I was on would intersect with Main Street just a short distance from me. I was walking toward that intersection, checking the time on my watch, when I remembered that Tyler's house was on this road. Just up ahead, as a matter of fact. I could see it from where I was, and when I reached the house, I stopped. I remember running across that lawn toward the back of the house. Tyler was a daredevil, so he had all sorts of homemade ramps and obstacles set up in the backyard. When I say homemade, I don't mean that his father or mother built them there. I mean that Tyler built them. They were never sturdy, and sometimes collapsed into a mess of deck chairs and cardboard boxes before he even had time to hurt himself. The name on the mailbox was still the same. His parents still lived there, so I went to the front door and knocked. I remember Mrs. Lowell from when I was a kid. She had long brown hair, which she usually kept braided. She was tall and thin and always smiling. With most parents, you could see the fatigue in their eyes and catch them snapping at their kids every so often. I don't remember Mrs. Lowell ever doing that. I just remember that she always had a sandwich for me when Tyler and I ran into the house, and there was an open invitation to dinner, which I don't think I ever took them up on. When she came to the door, the first thing that struck me was how short she was. I'd always pictured her as tall. Her hair was now shorter, but still brown. She was a little bit older. There were details that I'd forgotten, the mole on her jaw, the angle of her teeth. Just like the town itself, she was the same as before, but different than she had existed for so long in my mind. I smiled as the door opened and hesitated for a moment before speaking. I didn't know if she'd recognize me. For that matter, I didn't know if she'd even remember me. I could see the wave of puzzlement wash over her face, followed by questioning, and then decision. She smiled back and tilted her head as though to ask if it really was me. "Dale," she said. It was a statement, not a question. It turns out that Mrs. Lowell doesn't have an amazing memory or the keen ability to age-progress the memories of children that used to know her son. She's Facebook friends with my mother, so she's seen pictures of me. She's watched me grow up and already knew details of my life without my having to say a word. I stand by my opinion that technology is creepy and intrusive. After being invited inside the house, I looked around the place and felt as though I had transported back in time. While the action figures, baseball bats, and video game accessories were no longer scattered across the floor, the place was very much as it had been when I was a kid. It made me smile, because That house marked the first moment when I felt as though I'd truly come home. Mrs. Lowell offered me coffee and a muffin, and we sat in the kitchen catching up with each other as though she was my old friend rather than her son. We talked about a lot of things, like the fact that their roof had to be replaced the year before because a huge storm had torn through town. A couple of people had to do even bigger repairs. Their daughter, Jess, is a teacher now. She lives a few streets down with her boyfriend, my old friend, Caleb. Tyler lives in Middleton. He's a physical therapist, working mostly with people who have suffered brain injuries. He has a wife and 2 kids. Mike and Alex stayed in town through high school and then went away to college. Mike started a business in Tennessee, but still comes back to visit his parents and catch up with his friends. As Mrs. Lowell told me about Mike and Alex, she stopped short, smiled, and said that it was good to see me. Apparently, she keeps telling Tyler to get in touch with me, but he's convinced that I'd forgotten all about their little town. I got his email address. I'll send him a message when I settle into my new place. It's strange, looking back at how everything went down back then. There was no notice that I was leaving, and no chance for goodbyes. I remember it as a blur. One day we lived here, and the next, we didn't. For the longest time, I didn't even question it because I was glad to be away from it. I think that I convinced myself that everyone had forgotten about me because that made it easier to stay away. But as I sat there with Tyler's mom, I felt as though I were sitting there with an aunt that I hadn't seen in years, learning about family members that still mattered to me. As that thought occurred to me, another came with it. I asked Mrs. Lowell, "What about Alex? What's he doing these days?" That's when the mood changed. Mrs. Lowell looked down at her coffee cup and picked at the rim of it as she said, "Alex died about 6 years ago." A memory flashed before my eyes as I heard those words. I saw all of us from the old gang, racing each other down the street, running as fast as we could, sweaty, out of breath, but each of us trying to beat the others to the finish line. I was in the lead of that race until Alex slipped by me at the last moment with one final burst of energy. When the race was over and we all stood there, gasping for air, Alex put his hand on his hips, looked me in the eyes, grinned, and said, "I won." Now he was dead. His body was found in his apartment by his twin brother, Mike. He didn't die of a drug overdose or some incurable disease. He died because the old lady next door left her car running in the garage by mistake. It's a stupid, useless way to die. What do I do with that information? It stings. I feel robbed of the chance to sit around a table with my old friends and catch up. Then again, I don't feel entitled to claim that loss. The rest of them never stopped being friends. They went to high school together, and some of them are practically related at this point. Life went on, just like I always thought it did. Do I even get to claim a spot at the table chatting about old times? When I walked into that house, I expected pleasantries and nostalgia. I was happy to feel as welcome as I did, relieved to know that my time here didn't just blow away in the wind. Now I feel anger deep in the pit of my stomach. This place was my home. These people were my world. I shouldn't be looking at pictures of their prom night. I should be in those pictures. There was a whole other life that was stolen from me, and I'm still not sure that I understand what stole it. I get why my parents took me away. I needed help, and they didn't have a choice. My mother and Mrs. Lowell still keep in touch. That means that my mother probably knew what happened to Alex, and she didn't tell me about it. My parents must have had a conversation and made a decision to keep the information away from me, and I don't believe for one second that they thought I wouldn't care. While my old friends were gathering to mourn, there was an active campaign to keep me away. It's an unsettling feeling to know that you are the topic of conversations with people making decisions about your life behind your back. To know they have decided I couldn't come back here because they thought I was too damaged or weak to handle it. I think that Mrs. Lowell could see the emotions on my face, and like the experienced mother that she is, she sat back in her chair and asked me how it's been being back in Huxley. "Have you seen any old friends?" she asked. Perhaps it's because I was already feeling as though the world was conspiring against me, but I could have sworn that she was asking me about more than just my old school chums. I shook my head, and with a smile told her, Just you. How long are you in town? She asked. Just today, I replied. She nodded and sipped her coffee, and then said, It's a shame you can't hang around. I know Caleb would love to see you. Is he around? No, not today. A work thing, I think. Mrs. Lowell and I sat in silence for a few seconds, looking at each other as though we both knew what we weren't saying, and daring each other to be the first to bring it up. I didn't have time to play games, so I went first. I asked her, How much did Tyler tell you? He told me what he knew. And my parents? They told me as much as they could. I nodded and set my coffee cup down on the table in front of me. I tried to think of a way to talk about this topic, which I haven't spoken openly about in years. I wasn't sure how to approach the subject without sounding insane. There are things that happen in life which we can't begin to explain, Mrs. Lowell told me. We just do our best to cope. That's what your parents did. They should have told me about Alex. Mrs. Lowell nodded, seeming to agree with me at first, but then she bobbed her head and said, After the funeral, I was sitting with Alex's parents. They were trying to be strong and hold it together while everyone was around, but they were broken. How could they not be? Mrs. Lowell stood up and walked both of our cups over to the kitchen sink. She put them down and then turned to me again, leaning against the counter as she said, His father kept running through scenarios. Every so often, he'd cut off our conversation by telling us what he could have done differently and how he could have saved Alex. But we all knew the truth. Things happen in life, horrible things that have no business happening to anyone. When a parent fails to protect their child from those things, it kills us. Our one job in this world, the only thing that matters, is protecting our children, and we will do that, even if they hate us for it. Then Mrs. Lowell put on a pleasant smile and said, There's a reason why your parents took you away from this place. Once you're done here, don't come back.
This is the voice of the Embers, where stories burn and fade.